The rain came down in sheets, a relentless drumming against the old wooden house that felt like a heartbeat. Nia stood at the kitchen sink, the porcelain cool beneath her palms, and watched the water turn the dirt lane outside into a river of mud. The world beyond her small clearing in the woods had dissolved into a gray, churning chaos. It was a good night to be inside, a good night for the scent of cinnamon from the stovetop and the quiet breathing of her 7-year-old daughter, Zoe, asleep in the next room. Then came the sound. It wasn't the sharp crack of lightning or the groan of a falling branch. It was a wet, heavy thud, a sound of substance and finality, somewhere near the woodpile at the edge of her property. Nia's body went still. Country quiet meant you learned the rhythm of normal sounds. That was not one of them. She moved without thinking, her bare feet silent on the worn floorboards. She bypassed the phone, knowing the storm had likely killed the line hours ago. Instead, her hand closed around the handle of the cast-iron skillet she'd left by the stove. It was heavy, solid, a comforting weight in the face of the unknown. She didn't turn on the porch light. She didn't call out. She simply opened the door a crack and peered into the deluge. He was a heap of darkness against the paler darkness of the stacked logs.
A man.
For a moment, she thought he was dead, just another casualty of the treacherous backroads in a storm. But then a hand twitched, fingers curling into the mud. He was wearing a suit. Even soaked through and covered in grime, the cut of it was unmistakable. It was a garment that had no business being in her woods, a piece of another world entirely, tailored and impossibly expensive. Her principles warred with her survival instinct. A man was hurt, but a man in a suit like that, collapsed in the middle of nowhere during a biblical storm, was not a simple car accident victim. He was trouble. The skillet felt heavier in her hand. Zoe was asleep inside. But the rain was cold, and the man was bleeding. She could see the dark stains spreading on the side of his jacket, a slick, oily black in the gloom. She couldn't leave him there. Whatever he was still a man. Her competence, the part of her that had gotten her and Zoe through everything, took over. She made a choice. Dragging him inside was a nightmare. He was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and fine wool. She got him onto the braided rug in the living room, his head lolling to the side. The rain and mud and something metallic and coppery began to fill her small, clean house. Under the dim light of a single lamp, she saw him clearly for the first time. His face was carved from hard angles, cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass, a strong jaw shadowed with stubble. A thin, white scar ran parallel to his jawline, an old story written on his skin. His black hair was plastered to his forehead. He was Asian, Korean she thought, with eyes that were currently closed, shielding whatever lay behind them. She carefully cut away the fabric of his shirt and the jacket. The suit was a Tom Ford. She recognized the label from a magazine, a detail so absurdly out of place it was almost funny. The wound was a deep, ragged gash on his side. It looked like a gunshot. Her breath hitched. This was worse than trouble. This was the kind of trouble that came with other people looking for you. She worked quickly, her hands steady. She cleaned the wound with antiseptic from her first aid kit, her touch professional and impersonal. She found the exit wound on his back, cleaner a through and through.
Lucky.
As she was applying pressure to stop the bleeding, his eyes snapped open. They were not the hazy eyes of a man in shock. They were dark, sharp, and utterly lucid. They took in the room, her face, her hands on his body, all in a single, sweeping assessment. There was no fear in them.
No gratitud.
Only a cold, unnerving intelligence. Who are you? His voice was a low rasp, the English perfect but accented. The person keeping you from bleeding to death on their floor, Nia replied, her tone clipped. She refused to be intimidated in her own home. Don't talk. He ignored her, his gaze flicking to the skillet she'd left by the door. You were going to hit me with that. It crossed my mind, she admitted, pressing harder on the wound. He didn't flinch. He watched her for a long moment, his eyes tracking the movement of her hands. He seemed to be calculating, weighing variables she couldn't begin to guess. Finally, he closed his eyes again, a silent, grudging surrender to his body's weakness. She managed to stitch the worst of it closed, her movements deft from years of mending Zoe's clothes and her own. She wrapped his torso in clean bandages. He needed a doctor, a hospital, but the storm and the gunshot wound made that impossible. They were trapped. When she was done, she found him some of her late husband's clothes, a soft gray sweatshirt and sweatpants. They were too short, too broad in the shoulders, but they were dry. He changed without a word of complaint, his movements economical and precise, even when pain clearly shot through him. He set his ruined suit aside with a kind of reverence, folding the jacket despite the blood and the mud. He settled onto her couch, his posture rigid. The silence in the small house was thick, broken only by the storm and Zoe's soft snores from the other room. He saw her glance toward the bedroom door. "You have a child?" he asked. The question was flat, an observation. "A daughter," Nia said, her voice betraying nothing. "She's 7. His gaze drifted to the refrigerator, where one of Zoe's drawings was held by a magnet. A crayon rendering of a princess with brilliant brown skin and a wild tangle of black curls, standing next to a smiling son. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes before the mask of cold composure slid back into place. He did not ask her name. He did not offer his own. They were two strangers, bound by a storm and a secret written in blood on her living room floor. Nia didn't sleep. She sat in the armchair across from him, the skillet on the floor by her feet, and watched him. He seemed to rest but not sleep, a predator conserving its energy, aware of every creak of the old house. The storm broke with the dawn. Sunlight, watery and pale, filtered through the windows. The world outside was washed clean, green and glistening. The quiet was absolute. Nia went to the window, expecting to see the familiar sight of her woods, the steam rising from the damp earth. Instead, her blood ran cold. Lining the narrow dirt lane, parked with surgical precision, was a fleet of black cars. Sedans and SUVs, all gleaming, all identical, all menacing in their silent perfection. There weren't just a few. There were dozens. 50, at least. They surrounded her small, insignificant house like wolves circling a wounded animal. The world had found him. And in doing so, it had found her and Zoe, too. The man on her couch was already on his feet, standing beside her at the window. He looked not with alarm, but with the weary annoyance of a king surveying his court. "They're mine," he said, as if that explained everything. Doors opened in unison. Men in dark, impeccably tailored suits emerged, moving with a disciplined grace that was unnerving. They fanned out, securing the property line, their faces impassive, their eyes constantly scanning. One man, older than the others, detached from the group and walked toward the house. "Stay behind me," the stranger, her patient, commanded. It wasn't a request. He opened the door before the man could knock. The older man bowed his head slightly. "Jihan," he said, his voice laced with relief and respect. "We lost you after the ambush at the bridge."
Jihan.
The name settled in the air. He nodded, his expression grim. "The Park family? They believe you are dead," the man, Min, replied. Their celebration was loud, but their scouts are still sweeping the area. It is not safe. Jihan's eyes cut to Nia, who stood frozen in the doorway. He saw the understanding dawn on her face, the realization of what kind of man she had brought into her home. He was not a businessman who'd taken a wrong turn. He was a target, an ambush, a war. "The woman and her child will be relocated," Min stated, his gaze dismissive of Nia. "We have a secure hotel in the city. They will be compensated." "No," Jihan said. The word was quiet, but it held absolute authority. Min's head snapped up in surprise. Jihan turned to Nia, his dark eyes boring into hers. "You need a doctor," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The scale of his world was crashing down on her, threatening to sweep her and Zoe away. "I don't trust doctors," he said flatly. "They ask questions. Questions create witnesses. Witnesses become liabilities." He paused, his gaze intense. "I learned that lesson once." I will not learn it again. In that brief admission, she heard the echo of a ghost, a woman he had failed to protect. It was the first crack in his armor. You will finish what you started. It was an order, but it was also a strange form of trust. He was choosing her over his own people. He was pulling her deeper into his world, not pushing her out. The danger was no longer an abstract concept. It was a living thing, camped on her lawn. Min's men set up a perimeter. They were ghosts in the trees, silent and watchful. Her little house, her sanctuary, had become a fortress, a gilded cage. Later that day, Min approached her with a thick envelope of cash and a set of car keys. Mr. Kwan insists you are provided for, he said, his tone professional. A car will take you and the child wherever you wish to go. You will be safe. You will forget this happened. She could take it. She could run. She could take Zoe and disappear, try to reclaim the quiet life that had been shattered the night before. But she looked past Min, through the window, to where Jihan stood on her porch, his bandaged side a stark white against the gray of the sweatshirt. He was watching the woods, his posture that of a general surveying a battlefield. She realized with a sickening certainty that leaving his orbit now would not make her safer. The Park family, whoever they were looking for loose ends. Running would make her a loose end. Staying, under the watchful eyes of 50 men and their king, was the more intelligent gamble. I'm safer where you can see the threat coming, she said to Min, pushing the envelope back into his hand. Her own words surprised her. It was a deliberate choice. She was no longer just a victim of circumstance. She was staying. Min's eyebrows rose almost imperceptibly. He looked from her to his boss on the porch, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than dismissal was in his eyes. That evening, the house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the coiled silence of a predator waiting. Nia sat at her small kitchen table, a sketchbook open in front of her, the charcoal pencil in her hand moving automatically. It was how she processed the world, how she made sense of chaos. Jihan entered the kitchen, moving with a stealth that belied his injury. He stood behind her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. She could smell the faint scent of sandalwood from his own cologne, which must have lingered on his skin, mixed with the clean, sharp scent of the antiseptic she'd used. Her pencil stilled on the page. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze on her drawing. It was a sketch of the woods outside her window, but she had captured the tension, the feeling of being watched. The trees looked like silent sentinels. You see things others miss, he said, his voice a low murmur near her ear. Nia's breath caught. She turned her head, and her face was only inches from his. His eyes weren't cold now. They were dark and deep, and in them, she saw a flicker of something she hadn't seen before. Not calculation, not command, but a raw, unguarded curiosity. He was looking at her, Nia, not just the woman who had patched him up. The air between them grew thick, charged with unspoken words. The silence was not empty. It was filled with the weight of her choice and the terrifying possibility of what it meant. The fragile peace of their gilded cage was shattered by a single, sharp report. A high-velocity crack that was instantly followed by the sound of the living room window exploding inward. Glass sprayed across the floorboards. Nia's heart seized.
Zoe.
But Jihan was already moving. He moved faster than anything human had a right to, a blur of motion that defied his injury. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, grabbing Zoe from where she was playing with her dolls and shielding her small body with his own as he dropped to the floor behind the couch. Wood splinters from the window frame rained down, one of them grazing his arm, drawing a thin line of red. His men were instantly in motion outside, their voices clipped and professional over radios. The threat was neutralized in under a minute. But the violation had occurred. The sniper's bullet had been a message, aimed at him, but it had torn through her home, endangered her child. The war was no longer on her lawn, it was in her living room. Jihan held Zoe for a moment longer than necessary, his hands splayed across her back. When he looked up at Nia, his eyes were black with a fury so cold it was terrifying. It was the look of a man whose most sacred line had been crossed. The threat had become personal. 2 hours later, Min and 2 other men brought a captive to the old barn behind the house. He was one of the park scouts, a young man with terror in his eyes. They forced him to his knees on the dirt floor. Jihan entered the barn, his face a mask of cold fury. Nia watched from the house, her stomach twisting. She knew what was about to happen. This was his world, the brutal calculus of information and retribution. The scout started begging, his voice cracking. He spoke of his family, his children. Jihan's expression didn't change. He picked up a rusty pair of pliers from a workbench. Nia told herself to look away, to go to Zoe, to pretend this wasn't happening in the place where she used to store firewood and old garden tools. But she couldn't. She walked out of the house and into the barn, her footsteps unnaturally loud in the tense silence. "Leave," Jihan said without looking at her. She ignored him. She walked to the old water pump in the corner, filled a dusty glass, and brought it over. She didn't look at the terrified man on his knees. She looked directly at Jihan. She held out the glass. "He can't talk if he chokes," she said, her voice perfectly level. The air went still. Min stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. Jihan's eyes locked onto hers. He saw no judgment in her face, no plea for mercy. He saw only a chilling pragmatism that mirrored his own. She wasn't trying to save the man, she was trying to get the information they needed. She had crossed a line. In that moment, she stopped being an outsider and became a participant in the grim reality of his world. He took the glass from her, his fingers brushing hers. The brief contact was like a spark of electricity. That night, after the scout had been taken away and the new information processed, they found themselves alone in the kitchen again. The adrenaline had faded, leaving a hollow exhaustion in its wake. Zoe was safely asleep, a guard posted outside her door. Jihan stood by the counter, watching Nia as she wiped down surfaces that were already clean. "You should be afraid of me," he said. It was not a threat. It was a quiet, honest statement. She stopped wiping, her back still to him. "I am," she admitted, her voice low. She turned to face him, her eyes meeting his without flinching. "But I think you're more afraid of what happens when you fail to protect someone than I am of you." His composure cracked. For a heartbeat, she saw the man behind the monster, the man haunted by the ghost he'd mentioned. The vulnerability was so stark it made her ache. "In my world," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely allowed himself, "kindness is a liability. Decency is a weakness." He took a step closer, his presence filling the small space. "You are a dangerous complication, Nia." It was the most intimate confession he could make. He wasn't talking about the logistics of the war with the Parks. He was talking about her, about the effect she was having on him. He said her name, Nia, and it sounded different from anyone else. It sounded like a claim. The information from the scout was grim. The Parks knew a woman and child were in the house with him. They had identified her. The next message that came wasn't a bullet. It was a text to Min's phone, forwarded to Jihan. It was a photograph, taken from a distance, of Zoe's elementary school playground. The message was simple. Loose ends. The enemy was no longer targeting him. They were targeting her. "I'm leaving," Jihan announced the next morning. The finality in his tone was absolute. "My presence here is what endangers you. I will draw them away. Min and a team will stay. They will guard you and Zoe until this is over. You will be safe." He was trying to put her back in a box, to label her as a civilian to be protected. He was trying to undo her choice to stay, to undo the moment in the barn. Nia looked at the picture of her daughter's school on his phone, and then at him. The life she knew was already a ghost. Hiding in her house, waiting for his war to end, was not safety. It was a death sentence. "No," she said. The word was quiet but unyielding. "They aren't just after you anymore. They're after me, to get to you. Your fight is my fight now." She took a breath, the enormity of her own words settling over her. "Where you go, we go." Jihan stared at her, a storm of conflict in his eyes. Everything in his brutal, disciplined world screamed that she was right. She was no longer a civilian. She was a target, and the only way to protect a target was to keep it by his side. The plan was a high-stakes gamble. A convoy of 5 identical cars would leave the property, heading east. One would be a decoy, carrying a man of Jihan's build. Jihan, Nia, and Zoe would be in the third car, driven by Min. The Parks would take the bait, ambush the convoy, and Jihan's hidden forces would close in behind them, a hammer to their anvil. It almost worked. The ambush was sprung exactly as predicted. But as chaos erupted on the main road, one of the Park's cars, smarter or luckier than the rest, broke off, realizing the deception. It came after them, tires screaming on the asphalt. Min swerved, pushing the sedan to its limits on the winding country roads. A bullet shattered the back window. Min grunted, his shoulder jerking as a shard of glass sliced his arm. The car fishtailed. "There," Nia shouted, pointing. "Turn here." It was a narrow service road, barely more than a dirt track, hidden by overgrown bushes. It wasn't on any map. It was a road she knew from years of exploring these woods, a shortcut to the old reservoir. Min wrenched the wheel. The car plunged onto the track, branches scraping against the sides. They were bouncing, jostled, but they were hidden. They could hear the pursuing car roar past on the main road. Her knowledge, her life in this forgotten place, had saved them. She hadn't been a passive passenger. She had changed the outcome. She had saved him back. The aftermath was quiet. The Park family was broken, its leadership captured or eliminated in the failed ambush. The war was over. They were in a penthouse apartment overlooking the sprawling lights of Seoul. The contrast to her wooden house was so stark it felt like another planet. Zoe was asleep in a bedroom with a bed bigger than Nia's entire living room, watched over by a discreet female guard. Nia stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the river of light that was the city. Jihan came to stand beside her. A fresh cut from the chase marked his cheekbone. "Min told me to leave you at the house," he said, his voice low. He didn't look at the city, he looked at her. "He said you were a liability. A loose end to be sanitized once I was clear." Nia's heart tightened, but she wasn't surprised. It was the logical move. The ruthless move. He finally turned his gaze to the window, watching the endless stream of headlights below. He was wrong. He turned back to her, and his eyes, for the first time, were stripped of all their armor, all their calculation. They were just the eyes of a man who had been dragged back from a ledge. "You are not the weakness in my life, Nia. You are the only part that makes sense." It wasn't a declaration of love. It was something heavier. An acknowledgement. A truth that had cost them both everything to uncover. Her old life, the quiet and the peace, was gone forever, a casualty of his war. His solitude, the cold, safe fortress he had built around his heart, had been breached. He reached out, his hand moving with a slow, deliberate grace. She expected him to touch her face, to take her hand. Instead, his fingers, impossibly gentle for a man of such violence, brushed a stray curl from her temple and tucked it behind her ear. The light brush of his skin against hers was more potent than a kiss. It was a brand, a promise and a warning. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. She leaned into the touch, a barely perceptible surrender that was also a choice. Below them, his empire of steel and light glittered, a dangerous, beautiful kingdom. It was not the world she had been born into, but it was the one she was choosing now, standing beside him, ready to face whatever came next.